This is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers. First, though, our top stories this evening. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has called for a national circuit breaker lockdown to break the cycle of COVID-19 infections in the UK. Ministers will meet tomorrow to decide whether two regions, Greater Manchester and Lancashire, could be moved to the higher risk lockdown tier and subject to tougher restrictions. And pubs have closed, possibly for the last time in a month, in areas facing the strictest coronavirus restrictions from tomorrow. Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look then at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers. In the next half hour or so, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist and author, Isabel Oakeshott. Lovely to see you both. Hello to you. As ever, let's crack on and have a look at the front pages. The Financial Times then going with the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, calling on the government to institute a so-called circuit breaker lockdown for 2 to 3 weeks in order to bring the current flare-up of COVID-19 under control. Lockdown battle begins, proclaims the Telegraph, with Sir Keir setting out his vision of restrictions against that of the government. That story is also the lead for The Guardian, with the Labour leader saying Boris Johnson has lost control of the virus. While The Times says there's pressure on the Prime Minister to go for a half-term lockdown. The Yorkshire Post reports that Leeds could be among the next big cities to be placed under tighter restrictions. And in the Metro, Boris Johnson is accused of joking that people will be glad of the rule of 6 this Christmas, as it means they won't have to see their in-laws. Which, to be fair, is a joke that many people probably have said, isn't it? Sonia and Isabel are here with us. In the meantime, though, cases are rising and Keir Starmer has set out his stall. Explain this intervention, Sonia, to start with. The Guardian and many of the newspapers leading on it tonight.
Yes, so this is tonight's big story. So Keir Starmer gave a press conference this afternoon where he called on the government to introduce a 2 or 3 week, what's being termed as a circuit breaker lockdown. And this comes in the wake of SAGE papers, the Government Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, that were released late last night, which show that the government scientific advisors were recommending tougher restrictions way back on the sort of 21st of September, so 3 weeks ago. And they said that we needed a package of restrictions to halt increase in infection rates and therefore hospitalisations and deaths, and to stop essentially NHS getting overwhelmed. And they go through and they rate a package of measures by how likely each of those measures is to have an impact. And circuit breaker lockdown is considered to be one of the more effective ways of trying to get a grip of infection rates, which we all know are rising. The SAGE papers estimate that a 2 to 3 week lockdown could sort of save us time, as it were, of about 28 days. It could reduce the R by about 0.3 potentially. So it's clear that there were strong recommendations from the government scientific advisors for more measures to be put in place urgently about 3 weeks ago. The government clearly chose not to do that. They went with something quite incremental, the rule of 6 and the 10 p.m. curfew. And this is really Labour stepping up the pressure on the Prime Minister today, given what we're seeing happening to hospitalisation rates and death rates. So we've seen 143 people die today, very tragically, which is the highest in a long time. And as Jonathan Van Tam, one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers, said yesterday, some of these rates, we are going to see the death rate and hospitalisation rate climb over the next 2 weeks. Those figures are already baked in because they're relating to infections that would have happened 2 weeks ago.
Daily Telegraph, lockdown battle begins. Labour critics, Isabel, suggesting this is a cheap hit from the Labour leader. Your thoughts?
Well, there's certainly a dramatic escalation in the politics of this. To date, Keir Starmer has been quite quiet. In a sense, he hasn't really needed to do anything because he's just been able to stand back and watch the government kind of mess everything up. And his calculation tonight, I think, is that his intervention is a win-win, really, for him. If the government now caves in to his calls for a national lockdown, a so-called circuit break over half-term, then he can claim credit for that. If they, on the other hand, stand firm and don't do that, then Keir Starmer can say, pointing to an escalation in the number of deaths, hang on, I told you so, and you have now unnecessarily caused the deaths of X number of people. So this is a very, very politically very uncomfortable position for Boris Johnson. And interestingly, tonight, a very, very junior government aide, a Tory MP for Bolton, one of the new so-called Red Wall MPs, has resigned in protest at the government's handling of the lockdown, saying actually he thinks that the cure is worse than the disease. So Boris Johnson is facing pressure on all sides right now, not a position I think any of us would envy being in.
Absolutely. Virologists weren't sure, Sonia, that actually this 2-3 week lockdown idea would work anyway. But for the public, is it easier to think, I can do this for 3 weeks rather than I can do this drip feed thing for 6 months? Is there psychology at play here too?
I think there is a bit of psychology at play. I mean, if you read the SAGE papers, which I have, the scientists are really clear that we're in a new pandemic. There's limited evidence about all of these measures, so they have to make the best estimations that they can, knowing what we do about the virus and what's worked around the world. So the idea of a 2 to 3 week lockdown is you sort of put a brake on the exponential increase in infections, and you save yourself quite a bit of time, and you can save yourself a lot of hospitalizations, deaths, and damage to the economy later down the line. So that's where the thinking is. So it's clear that the scientists on SAGE do think that this would have some impact, and I think that's why Labour's gone for it. I think what's interesting is that what some of the papers are reporting tonight is that people in government think it's sort of inevitable that the government may end up here by half term. I think it's interesting that on the one hand, you've got Conservative Party sources telling news outlets tonight, oh, this is just Keir Starmer being a total political opportunist. But on the other hand, you've got some sources briefing the papers saying, actually, we think there's an 80% chance that this is going to happen anyway. So I do think it's something that we're quite likely to see happen down the line.
Yes, one health psychologist I heard that we had on earlier called it death by 1,000 cuts, which is what we're going through at the moment. But Keir Starmer, the FT reporting there, suggesting that months and months of the virus out of control would do far more damage to the economy. And there is a suggestion that if you let the virus continue as it is, then you get public health workers who are ill, the hospitals cease to function because of that, the schools can't stay open because of that. You know, the Tory right or the libertarians who don't want to see lockdowns, does any of that argument, can they hear any of that argument, or what is their justification for continuing to let the economy go as it is while the virus is out there? Isabel.
Well, let me just comment on this idea that this is some kind of niche right-wing libertarian view. Let's put some of these figures and some of these quite inflammatory phraseologies that are being used into context. The average age of a COVID-associated death is 82, over 82 in fact, which is actually older than average life expectancy. At the moment, the hospitals are miles off being overwhelmed. The number of people in hospital with COVID-associated conditions is about 4% of hospital beds. So we are very, very, very far off being in a situation where the NHS is overwhelmed. Yet at the same time, we've got 110,000 people on waiting lists for hospital treatments for over a year. This is taking us back to the kind of dark ages of the John Major regime, the end of the old Tory era when waiting lists were at this level. I had a desperate plea from a cancer doctor tonight who knew I was coming on Sky saying, please, please make it be known that some of us in the medical community are terribly worried about our cancer patients at the moment. They're too afraid to come in and get tested. They're too afraid to come in and get treatment. The cost of this on so many levels is enormous. And it's really important to remember that the SAGE scientists, brilliant scientists as they are, their job is to try to reduce the number of coronavirus deaths. That's what they have been employed by this government to do right now. Their job is not to run the country or balance all the other factors that need to be taken into account.
It's not true that their job is just to reduce coronavirus deaths. Their job is to look at public health in the round. I think if you look at what's happening in hospitals in hotspot areas, so if you're looking, for example, at hospitals in Liverpool, doctors there are really expressing concerns that intensive care wards are filling up with COVID patients. I think the other thing to make clear is that this isn't just about deaths. It's also people getting very sick with this and being in hospital. And when people get very sick with it, they may not die, and hopefully the death rate will not be as bad this time, because we know that treatments are improving, although there obviously still will be some deaths. But it's that, you know, when people get very sick with it, they will be in hospitals, there will be infection risk to other people, and that crowds out other services from the NHS. I think one thing that is really positive is that we know that this time the NHS is planning for this differently. So I think there's a general consensus that elective care has to somehow continue. And actually the biggest risk to elective care is if there aren't restrictions and you see hospitals getting overwhelmed in a few weeks' time. But what the NHS is planning to do is to have COVID and non-COVID designated hospitals. So, you know, if you're going in for cancer care, etc., and you're not COVID positive yourself, you'll be able to go to a non-COVID hospital, so that there's much less risk of you contracting the virus when you're immunosuppressed and you're receiving cancer treatment. So I think, you know,
and yet, Sonia, the chief executive of NHS providers representing trusts said that even without being overwhelmed, already hospitals have lost 10 to 30% of their capacity because of the need to separate out COVID patients. So that's already happening, the loss of capacity. Let's go to the Times if we can, just quickly, because we're running out of time for this part. Pressure grows on the Prime Minister for a half-term lockdown. Yesterday, obviously, Isabel, we had Chris Whitty, who was not confident that Tier 3 restrictions, which is the Liverpool City region, as we know so far, he was not confident that would be enough. Do you think there is an inevitability that we will all have some form of national lockdown for the half-term period?
Well, I watched Chris Whitty and he made his reservations very plain indeed without having to really spell them out too loudly. I don't think it's inevitable, but I think these drum beats are getting louder. I think it is very, very worrying that they are doing so. And I think that the consequences of a half-term lockdown will be catastrophic economically. And the economy isn't some kind of, you know, vague concept here. It is people's lives. We're not talking about money in the abstract here. It's livelihoods, it's other health. And I think that the repercussions will be very, very serious indeed. And it won't just be half term, will it? You know, if we do this again, we'll do it again at Christmas and again and again.
Absolutely. Well, we will talk about unemployment, the issue of redundancy after the break. Also, that Boris Johnson joke about the prospect of a lockdown at Christmas. Back in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome back to both of you. Boris Johnson, Metro, reportedly tried to joke about his rule of 6, suggesting people might welcome it as an excuse to avoid their in-laws this Christmas. Isabel, what do you think?
What I think is that is perfectly fine. And are people seriously upset by this? I mean, it's not exactly the most tasteless of jokes. It's a quip, you know. Times are pretty dark. If people are getting worked up by the Prime Minister in a meeting with his own MPs making a kind of aside like that, they clearly haven't got better things to worry about, which would seem slightly strange under the circumstances.
Sonia?
I mean, look, it's a very Boris Johnson joke, isn't it? It's a sort of quip that he comes out with. I can understand why some people might get upset with it if they've lost people to COVID. You know, I've seen some people say on social media that they've sort of lost members of their family that they would have been hoping to spend Christmas with, and this joke doesn't ring that true with them. So, you know, I can see why they're upset about it. I wouldn't criticise them for it.
Meanwhile, we've just done live with Liverpool as they shut up bars and pubs, maybe for the last time in a month. It's desperately depressing there, possibly more places. The negotiations we know with local leaders are continuing. The Guardian reporting on the record rise in people being made redundant. This is really the sharp end now, isn't it, Isabel?
It is, and this is just the start. We are going to see these figures absolutely rocket in months to come. As everybody knows, the unemployment figures already looking pretty grim have been masked in many ways by the Chancellor's very successful furlough scheme. And, you know, this is what I'm saying. These are livelihoods. These are people who are losing their jobs in the run up to Christmas. And, you know, this idea of so-called circuit breakers is so very, very difficult for people who run businesses to handle. How can they stagger on, you know, if they think maybe we can get through the next 2 weeks, but what is going to happen next if the government is setting a pattern of stop-start like this? Look, there's no vaccine in sight right now, so I just don't really think it is a viable policy to keep hiding away.
Just under a minute left, Sonia, and the difficulty is that much of the help from the Treasury has focused on jobs and people, not necessarily on businesses, which, as we know, are viable in different circumstances.
I think that's right, and a lot of the support is coming to an end. And the issue is here, if we don't take action, if we don't impose restrictions now for a short period of time to sort of try and break the circuit, you could potentially be looking at a much bigger scale, longer term lockdown later on, which should be even worse for the economy and jobs. So I don't think there is this sort of trade-off in the here and now between the economy and public health and the NHS. What we need, though, is we need the government to extend its generous financial support for people who can't go to work, for businesses who are struggling, so that actually they know that if you're going to have a 2-week lockdown to try and reset and bring infection rates down, you know, it will be taken care of. The financial side will be taken care of by the government. And we're a rich society, we can afford it.
OK, we'll have plenty more from you at 11:30. Lovely to see you both. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Check out the weather.